Ever since I saw Matt Reeves as the Batman at the theater back in 2022, it's stuck with me. Sitting in front of the silver screen, I found myself captivated by the seedy noir of Gotham and how its underbelly is only illuminated by this blaring yet understated red glow of vengeance. Characters are so much more than their comic book counterparts, but rather a murky representation of how choice shapes identity and the chaos that ensues as these choices ultimately collide and intersect. There was something I had never seen before with the cinematography, as it places a big emphasis on rhythm as it lingers on moments that we don't expect to be as dark as they are. The audience has an intimate connection to the camera, not just in the way it often gets dirty through raindrops and grimy imaging, but also as it shows us the unique perspective of characters and moments we don't normally have as audience members. I love the darkness and melancholia of Robert Pattinson's Batman, partly because I find a weird kind of joy in how emo and angsty he is. Like, bro really was that kid in the back of the bus listening to Nirvana unironically. But I also loved how that darkness produces its own special brand of hope. A hope that comes from the feeling that because things have become so somber for Bruce, they have nowhere else to go but up, and he has nothing else to do but change. As a new Rockstars Breakdown fan, it was only natural that when videos breaking down the Batman started popping up on my Discover page, I would click on them, engrossing myself with all the things I'd missed and thematic details that only made my love for the movie further validated. But I also couldn't shake the feeling that there was something missing. There was some element that was so understated yet crucial to the story, some aspect of the film that was still lingering with me that no one was talking about. A piece that was so essential that watching the movie again without it would mean an entirely different experience. I'm talking about the soundtrack. Michael Giacchino has long been one of my favorite current film composers, sitting just behind John Williams and probably at the same level as Hans Zimmer. Not just for his absolutely insane body of work, but the amount of memorable moments of film that we owe to him. There's something so magical when a certain moment from a movie or feeling can be evoked by playing a simple melody. You can be in the middle of studying or working out or even scrolling through TikTok, and all of a sudden you're back in the place you first heard it, or another place entirely. That is the magic that Michael Giacchino is a master at capturing, as we've seen in any of his films from Up to The Incredibles and Ratatouille. Like, seriously, I'm sure as soon as I said all of those movies, you not only pictured the characters, certain scenes, or even different colors in your mind, but also specific musical moments and motifs from a certain one. This is how I believe this movie has been criminally undervalued, because for all its well-deserved hype for action sequences, editing, and overall production quality, the soundtrack deserves to live in our heads too, and the reasons why are what I'd like to discuss in this video essay. But before we dive in, let me just say that while I love music, I am by no means an expert. I've definitely got a musical background, having played instruments and done marching band in high school, but I honestly don't know much about all the deeply nuanced sides of understanding music theory and all its components. In fact, I outsourced to a lot of my friends from high school with questions about how to phrase things the right way because I just wasn't sure. In fact, I know enough to know just how much I don't know. So if you're looking for an in-depth analysis of the modal qualities of different motifs and melodies a la Sideways, you'll have to forgive me because I just don't understand all of that stuff, and I definitely don't want to pretend I do either. Instead, I want to stick to the area that I feel I have a slightly stronger foot in, and that is how the music complements thematic material from a narrative standpoint, as well as other elements of the filmmaking. But more than that, I've literally just fallen in love with this soundtrack and all it has to offer, and if you allow me, I would love to gush about it in the most academic way possible. Okay, let's begin with the obvious caveat to this video, in that I've just talked about how unmemorable the music of this movie is in comparison to other films, especially through social media, when Nirvana's Something in the Way literally blew up all over society in the wake of the Batman's release. In fact, back in 2022, when the first trailer featuring the track was released, the song peaked on several charts across Billboard, Amazon Music, and iTunes, far surpassing its popularity during its original release over 30 years ago. When writing the first act, Matt Reeves reported that Something in the Way played a crucial role in not just developing the story, but also the specific adaptation of the Bruce Wayne character, and how this melancholic and reclusive take would be portrayed. Film adaptations are often so fascinating to me because they provide a really unique way of experiencing cinema, as different takes will teach you about the art of filmmaking and the nature of interpretation. It's taking the idea of giving each of your creative writing students the same prompt and dialing it to the max as you end up with results that deviate from the next entirely. So, it only makes sense that with every new iteration of any major story, these are the questions that occupy our minds as intuitive moviegoers. We want to know who this new Batman will be. who's telling the story, but most importantly, what specific elements will allow a unique story to be portrayed. When it comes to adaptation, Matt Reeves' specific focus on character and unique inspiration to incite a unique portrayal has got to be one of the greenest flags possible, especially as the Batman story is at its best and most naturally driven by forming your narrative around this character. Like any great hero story, Batman is best driven by a narrative that strives to marry the identity of Bruce Wayne with his alter ego. But what sets this movie apart is the fact that there seem to be real repercussions for the trauma of Bruce's past that both incite this addiction to being the Batman, but also how it helps him to grow. He's not some super skilled, ripped martial arts playboy who always knows what move to make next. Instead, he makes mistakes, and a lot. His motivations for donning the mask and prowling the streets are convoluted, and it isn't always clear what his ultimate goal is. So, why was Something in the Way so pivotal for Reeves' interpretation, and how are the elements of this song used to express these characteristics? How can we read Reeves' line of inspiration as we connect the song to this Batman? To start, there's the obvious thematic material that the lyrics provide as Kurt Cobain paints a dreary kind of fever dream, leaning on simplicity and repetition in order to create this depressing state. The audience is thrust underneath the bridge, a weight looming over us as we long for shelter, a refuge from a storm we can't even see. However, the tarp has sprung a leak, and although we're living off the drippings from the ceiling, the water has begun to encroach on this dwelling. Despite finding a place to rest, there's still something leaking through, something that is both a blessing and a curse as it symbolizes the heaviness that comes from being able to discern what will ultimately help us or hinder us when it comes to a stable state of mind. Despite the barriers we build, the places we escape to, there's always something in the way. And as the lyrics move along, the repetition mirrored in a repetitive melody evoke a sense of urgency, yet inevitability. There's somewhere we're trying to get to, things we're trying to say, but ultimately end up at the same dead end, unable to see through what's in the way or even recognize it. This is highlighted in the literal repetition that something is in the way. But how does the music tell us this? To begin, the song is in F minor, so to put that in simple terms, the third scale degree is lowered to the minor third rather than being played as the major third. And to make that even simpler, this is what makes the song sound sad rather than happy. It's the subtle difference that conveys melancholy, despair, distress, and hopelessness as something isn't quite right. A key distinction that lays the framework for the rest of the song, and what makes the rest of the soundtrack so genius, as Michael Giacchino has placed the major motif of this song as something in the way of the entire score. The very first notes we hear at the beginning are E natural and C, and it's important to note that the scale that this song is based on begins on F, which is just a half step above E. In this way, we begin our melody not at home, on F, but rather just below it. We're so close yet not quite there. We move on from E to the C below it, and remain at this interval using the two notes as a solemn gait of a funeral march, leading us forward, but we don't really know where. Repeated over and over again, it becomes like the only thing carrying us forward, a kind of drum beat that slowly fades into the back as white noise with the addition of further elements of the song. And yet, it still remains in the shadows, an unseen force pulling us to trudge forward but without a clear destination. As inspiration for the song, many critics cite Cobain's brief period of homelessness as he often drifted from couches to street corners to even the bridge mentioned at the beginning. And while it may not be clear exactly what he was going through at the time, it isn't hard to see the overall themes that Nirvana was trying to touch on. Through these elements, the band addresses loneliness and longing under the guise of depression, but do it in a roundabout way. The subject matter of the lyrics is wanton, the melody incredibly simple and focused, yet because there is so much repetition, their message and purpose begins to fade, leaving us without a sense of direction, and Cobain not just struggling with his own identity and loneliness, but whether or not he even cares anymore. Much of the lyrics focus on tight restriction, but also moments of release. Underneath the bridge, the symbol of something that holds two things together and looming over waters that flow freely, yet the tarp has sprung a leak. The water is seeping through despite restriction and protection. The animals that I've trapped here have all become my pets, is a staggering statement as we begin to consider the imagery of the previous line, and it begins to symbolize the mind. Is it a bridge that hangs over us, or rather a dam keeping the inner demons back that we aren't even sure exist? This is even more than just homeless Cobain dwelling under a bridge and feeding the rats that scurry around him. This is a statement of the animals trapped within, or the demons that we carry with us through life. Demons that we know will bring us the most relief if we can just let them go, but we've built a home for them in our minds and we literally don't know how to let them go anymore. It's the reason people hang on to things they haven't used in years or remain in relationships that haven't been working, because it's more painful to let go and accept a new reality than to remain in the present one. And it's only until the current reality becomes more than we can bear, only when we hit rock bottom, that change feels possible and we're motivated enough to try. This is exactly the realization that Bruce comes to, and this is exactly what Michael Giacchino is able to convey through the use of two simple notes. Trauma. Does it shape identity? And if so, is trauma's influence over who we are another indicator of whether we are good or bad people? Or is that definition that exists on another plane, at the hands of something deeper? These are the questions that Giacchino grapples with through the score and what he introduces us to from the very first downbeat. Thursday, October 31st. After the Riddler has killed Mayor Don Mitchell, after Bruce has already become Batman, the streets of Gotham are bathed in a dark rain that runs down drain pipes, carrying, rather than cleansing, the pasty residue of face paint, crime, and a seedy underbelly. There is no renewal in each drop. The city is a darkened playhouse, an apocalypse existing only in shadow, rather than the undisguised flames of hell. The Batman makes his way through the streets hunting, a predator on the prowl, a hooded figure barely distinguishable from the murder we were just witnesses to. A dichotomy is created, an invisible link between hero and antagonist, separated visually but continually connected sonically. We hear this motif, the Batman or Vengeance motif, as I'll refer to it, introducing us to not just Matt Reeves' Gotham, but also the nature of our hero and what he represents. The first part is a 3-note melody that plays over a montage of our hero mixed in with various crimes being committed throughout the city. Each individual culprit laden with not just the burden of their actions, but the threat of the Batman hanging over them. Will they be the one to be caught tonight? Will they be the one he chooses? Or will they be lucky enough to escape what will always confront them in the end? I love this introduction and the imagery it incites at the very beginning. As Robert Pattinson's Batman reads his journal, an excerpt of his Gotham project, we get the sense that this is not just a man seeking to do good in a city plagued with fear, but rather a true vigilante. Someone who not only masks his face, but also his intentions, as he seems to be driven primarily by what he can never give to himself: vengeance. He takes the idea of vengeance to the extreme, using it to justify violence and the use of sheer terror in order to accomplish his end goal. And while he may not be seen as a criminal in the same sense as the dropheads and other gangbangers, his use of vengeance is different in the simple way the idea of intention plays into it. In this Gotham City, vengeance is a common tool used by various platforms both with and without power. But only those with the most power are privileged enough to not have their use of vengeance questioned. For Bruce, at least, it's about more than just power. He is powerless to the trauma he has endured in the same way that many who are born into cycles of poverty and crime are often shackled by their circumstances, which is what makes Bruce's use of the Batman as a coping mechanism so insightful, as it mirrors the criminals he seeks to correct, the corruption in Gotham as a whole, and especially the Riddler. And although it may not be quite as obvious from the beginning, as we really only are introduced to the Riddler as a question rather than an identity, every single element that goes into this intro is meant to tie us from the Batman to the Riddler, especially in the music. Now, I'll never forget the feeling of sitting in the theater and listening to this motif play throughout the soundtrack, and realizing that you could totally hear the Imperial March. As a lover of film score, and especially John Williams, I've always loved being able to find references to his work and other scores, as well as classical music that Williams himself has referenced. I love the fact that music can be this universal, and that the music I was playing in my high school band could also be the stuff that famous film composers were referencing, and that a score could be rich not just in thematic material, but also historical context. It just adds another layer, another angle to appreciate and understand the music, and what this reference adds to the themes portrayed in the Batman is gonna blow your mind, I swear, because it totally blew mine. Originally, it was this reference that inspired this entire video essay. I wanted to base everything around the Imperial March and how using it builds the framework for the entire score, but as I was doing research and listening to the soundtrack over and over again, trying to find just what I wanted to say about the score in the Imperial March, I ran into a problem. I realized that I didn't know nearly enough about music theory as I wanted to in order to fully express my thoughts, and also simply that I had no idea why I kept hearing the Imperial March in these two parts of the Vengeance motif. The first being that we hear at the very beginning, and the second being that follow them eventually and also reference back to Nirvana's Something in the Way. I thought about intervals and major thirds and minor thirds and what the key signature could be and harmonic minors and how those could factor in, but ultimately all it came down to was simply combining the two melodies from Standing Alone to Being One. This is significant to me because it takes the interval from something in the way that we previously discussed and combines it with something new in order to reference a motif that has become the quintessential bad guy song throughout all of media. Think of all the times you've heard this theme outside of just the Star Wars movies. All the royalties these guys have made off the Imperial March, of who you could play this song for that has never heard it, what makes it so universal, what makes it so easily recognizable, and what makes it such a great tool that Giacchino uses in his composer's toolbox for the score. Perhaps these are questions better saved for another time, and for the sake of this video, and honestly my own lack of knowledge, as I've stated probably more times than necessary, a really interesting explanation is in its reference to Mars from Gustav Holst's The Planets. Acting as the first movement in Holst's suite, Mars introduces us to this work through an ominous pulsing that eventually gives way to a discordant confrontation at the end. The melody begins in the low brass that soars and swells through the different sections all over the constant foreboding knocking of the low strings. It's heroic, epic, and brazen, yet villainous and terrifying as the drum beat gets passed from section to section throughout most of the song, reminding us of some of man's greatest fears: war, the threat of violence, the unknown, and most of all, the passage of time. The strings march on, then the trumpets, and eventually comes back to the strings as the brass begins to mimic the march-like rhythm, yet as a melodic motif rather than a layer to the music. The notes are staccato, harsh and short, and almost seem to attack us. The bringer of war is poised and ready to strike, a domineering figure both leading his troops into battle, yet remaining deceitfully in the shadows. In this way, Holst paints themes of violence, fear, and foreboding, both for their upfront confrontations and understated ones, the unknown possibilities that linger at the brink of the imagination, surreptitiously teetering off the edge. What better way to represent the most terrifying and dominant force in the entire galaxy? A force that has completely changed entire cultures, history, and meanings of life. Williams's use of Mars evokes not only the feeling of a terrifying military threat that one would be insane to even think about defying, but also our own sense of familiarity. Something that feels almost ancient and inherent as man's primal fight or flight instinct in our history of war. And if you're still not convinced of the impact of these pieces, think of how the Imperial March went from representing simply the Empire to the specific character of Darth Vader, simply at the hands of the audience, the individual viewing experience. People were so terrified and intimidated by the collision of the music with this menacing figure that its representation and original purpose changed completely, showing how much meaning an audience's interaction with the score truly is. Effectively, it's an example that the greatest artists know all too well. You can put everything you have into something you create, but at the end of the day, all art is meant to be engaged with, thus adding an entirely new level to what you originally created simply because of individual interaction. You end up with, for better or for worse, more than you could possibly imagine. For more examples of just how powerful this reference to classical music and film score has been, listen to the way the iconic strings from Psycho parallel what we hear at the beginning. Or how this tiny part towards the end is used to evoke drama in a classic film like Vertigo. Literally, even Bowser's airship from Super Mario Bros. References this piece for different reasons. My point in saying all this is the simple fact that we've heard this before, and honestly, I'll make an entire video dedicated to why people should listen to classical music at some point, but there's a reason why when you hear a certain motif or theme that it's so effective and so impactful. It's because despite what people may think, a key component of being a great artist is understanding how to use the art of the past, what's come before, to stand on the shoulders of giants and craft something unique out of what has come before, because at the end of the day, all art is imitation. But it's not the imitation that makes an artist great, and rather the individual's ability to walk that line, to understand the nuance of imitation mingled with inspiration, and using previous works to honor the craft and make something new, because while humans are naturally wired to recognize patterns, we are also naturally wired to crave newness, the unseen and untold. So when someone comes along and is able to create in this way, it's a feat to be cherished and an accomplishment worthy of the highest praise and study. It's the mark of true mastery over discipline, and is what makes both John Williams and Michael Giacchino the masters that they are. In one of the greatest character introductions I've seen in the past 10 years of filmmaking, these are the elements brought to the table through the score. As the montage continues and Can't Fight City Halloween is placed in the background, different families of instruments seem to pop out of the shadows with little motifs of their own. We hear strings twittering in the back as the low brass swells, evoking the epic themes from Hans Zimmer's score for Christopher Nolan's Batman trilogy. As scarred and twisted undercurrents of the strings in this world collide with those familiar notes, Giacchino is able to prepare us for a new Gotham that is similar to what we know, yet completely different. The notes stacked in the brass are where we first hear the two-note part of the Vengeance theme, what we hear in Something in the Way, as they begin being played together but ultimately divide as we see a shadowy silhouette of Bruce smearing his face with blackened makeup. This is where the notes finally come to life as a motif as we are introduced to our hero. It's significant to me that this is where we first hear a recognizable tune meant to represent the Batman, and yet we begin with Bruce, or rather the ghost of what Bruce has become, a shadowy, enclosed figure hunched over the darkness he has learned to don each night. But Giacchino will go on to add so much more depth to this representation of vengeance as this opening montage progresses through key elements of editing, cinematography, and overall direction. We as the audience come to recognize that the reactions of these various criminals is tied specifically to him, as this motif both connects and scares them back into their respective hideouts. Through the vengeance motif, there's a repetition that reminds us of the militaristic elements mentioned before, and I love how the score grows ever more menacing and imposing as the sequence moves on. As the strings intensify, engaging more directly with our sense of fight or flight, the brass continues steadily on in the back, a kind of twisted and synthetic heartbeat, advancing towards us behind the scenes. It's impending, it's stressful, and terrifying. And that's what makes it the perfect theme to introduce how this film wants us to think about fear. It's not just something forcing us to fight or flee, but rather just as Bruce says, a weapon. Finally, the Batman marches forward out of the shadows, a lone gunslinger in a neo-noir western of his own making, wielding the weapon of fear merely in his footsteps. There's something confining, restricting about this dogmatic melody that just doesn't seem to let up. But then, just as he takes his last step forward, it stops. The gang member asks him who he's supposed to be, and rather than make that confrontation through words as he's just done with us, he begins by releasing a flurry of swollen rage and violence. With each punch, each contact, the sound design is almost deafening as the hits sink almost deep into our own chests, engaging us sonically in a way that feels different from the rest of the sequence so far. As the music cuts out entirely, building to the very climax of this introductory scene to our hero, he finally speaks. I'm vengeance. Now you may be wondering, okay, why is she talking so much about a simple character introduction? Robbie's a baddie, he beats up the dude, scares the guy a little, but it all fits this emo Batman, so it's pretty straightforward, right? Well, because we're working with a superhero story, paying attention to the hero's introduction is uniquely important because these are stories often driven by not just these characters, but also the broader cultural influence they've had throughout time and space. Analyzing how filmmakers introduce us to iconic characters like Darth Vader, Jack Sparrow, or even Elle Woods can teach you a lot about the art of filmmaking. But characters with expansive cultural significance, ones that have been recreated and reimagined hundreds of times like Batman, James Bond, Joe March, it teaches us something on like a metaphysical level because there's a specific focus on choice. Each choice shapes a specific identity and something new that a creator wants to say about the pre-existing themes surrounding these characters. For example, there's a difference between how we're introduced to Andrew Garfield's Spider-Man as it places a bigger emphasis on Peter's connection to his family and how that shapes his identity rather than Tom Holland's Spider-Man, as it places a bigger emphasis on not just how the burden of responsibility shapes identity, but also within the greater context of the Avengers as a whole. And even then, we have Tobey Maguire's Spider-Man, whose intro borderline breaks the fourth wall with his narration, ironically acknowledging the cultural significance of seeing the character for the first time on the silver screen in a standalone film. With the Batman, it's no different. Matt Reeves wants to shape his Caped Crusader's identity through not just what we already know about the Batman story, but specifically the connection between vengeance, fear, and trauma, and where justice can be found among them. The choices the entire team has made have all shaped who our hero is, so why doesn't it feel very heroic? Why are the punches so deafening? Why is it not just the characters in the scene who are afraid, but also us? An outstanding choice made by Matt Reeves and Michael Giacchino is, of course, the music, because instead of hearing the bravado of this action sequence through appropriate music, we instead first hear complete and utter silence, followed by not some sweeping heroic theme that triumphs overall. As the Batman takes down his attackers, picking them off one by one, it's just the steady beat of the melody droning on, no different than before. For all the fear it's meant to incite, a justification of violence through vengeance, it's stuck with nowhere to go, never building on itself, never adapting, and never changing. A few specific elements of the filmmaking that I love from this introduction are also how the camera spends a few moments simply lingering in the subway tunnel. We go back and forth between these moments of being up close to the action, but then back at a wider view. The action also remains specifically on the Batman from an objective point of view, watching him specifically. When the Batman finally tases his last opponent, the strings wail and flutter along. The man falls to the ground, the rest of the thuds scurry like rats, and he stares blankly into the face of the last one, until he, too, makes his retreat. These strings return once again in the lower verses for just a moment as he focuses on the man who was being attacked, establishing a conflicting connection between his violent methods and motivations. To me, this introduction is incredible. It's an outstanding showcase of what a soundtrack can do, how it should be used, and the perfect example of how it will be used as a storytelling device throughout the rest of the film. First, Giacchino established a connection between the Batman and a musical idea. We then connect the idea to the themes of what shape this specific adaptation's identity: fear and vengeance. We get a display of what happens when he wields these as his motivations, his superpower to aid in defeating bad guys, if you will. We then end up with the consequences. But all throughout the sequence, the music is incredibly intelligent, changing how we understand Bruce's use of vengeance. Throughout the film, we see him kind of bang his head into the same wall over and over again, chained to this idea of what justice should look like through vengeance. It's in the way he views Selina and her background and his narrow view of Gotham as a whole. It's in the way he's willing to work with Gordon, but despite his best efforts, his way allows things to slip through the cracks. It's in the way that, because of this obsession, he neglects the parts of life that are the most rewarding, the parts of himself that are too painful to take care of. Rather than playing some heroic theme that would normally help solidify the heroic nature of his actions for the audience, the music is understated, sinister, and dogmatic. It's a broken record stuck in the same cycle, yet paradoxically hindered by what should break that cycle from continuing. Much like how unchecked trauma leads us into destructive cycles that, because of fear, lead us to extreme ends with little regard for the means. In this way, vengeance is captured not through the light of justice, but rather trauma, and the journey that Bruce will take to face this trauma is what drives the plot of this movie, and also exactly what further elements of the soundtrack help us to understand. Now, if you've made it this far, I seriously cannot thank you enough. This is part one of a probably multiple part series, as I've said before. I have a problem of just writing too much and caring too much, I think, but the fact that I get to write about film and music all in one is really special for me because these are art forms that I cherish, and film is such an incredibly unique art form, and I can't wait to see what we do with it in the future, how it will go on to impact and change culture and the way that we interact with each other as humans and share art and appreciate art. It would mean the world to me if you gave me a like and subscribe to my channel for more content related to music and film and everything in between. I already have a lot of ideas of things that I want to write about related to film, and I can't wait to share them with you guys. So until then, I thank you so much once again, and I will see you next time. Bye!